Welcome back to the Peace Offering Podcast. Today's interview is with Dr. Rick Cohen. Dr. Rick is a leading authority in the fields of nutrition, sports performance, and longevity medicine. We talk about metabolic health, markers of metabolic health, um, how that relates to longevity, inhibitors of longevity, as well as his personal strategies for improving things. I hope you enjoy this interview. Well,
Awesome.
so thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Rick, for joining the program. We are really looking forward to hearing your view on health and for the listeners and for yourself, how I found you was through Morley Robbins, and um, I was talking to him a couple months ago about a mitochondrial test that was done in Germany. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I know this test, and you need to talk to Dr. Rick, and you need to talk to Jillian." And they use this test, and so I was quite interested in that because a lot of my focus has been around optimizing, in particular, the electron transport chain and the complexes and the proton gradient, the electron flow, and all the end products there that occur. And so that's initially how I got into finding you, and then you shared with me this just sort of epic vision for the future of health and for sort of the larger impact of humanity. And so anyway, that's how I got into it. And then I saw there was also sort of a common ground around iron toxicity and how it impacts longevity and health span. And so that is another thing that I'd like to cover with you today, if you're okay with that. But before we get into those details, if you could share with us this vision of quantum longevity, what it is that you're trying to put together, and looks like some of it is already put together, actually.
So some of it is, yeah. So to give you a background, I'm a medical physician, was more of a functional physician, but always an engineer, sort of out of the box thinker. I tend to like to connect dots, right? And put together puzzle pieces. Some people have to go really deep, and which is great. You need the deep people who go down the rabbit hole. But sometimes if you're so deep in the rabbit hole, you never see the other rabbit holes or the other connections. Um, I've always been interested in health and fitness and longevity. And, it's almost like I was waiting for the past 3 to 5 years, for technology and, um, you know, capabilities to sort of say, whoa, okay, I think we could do something now with it. So as I became more involved in the space and starting to, talk to leaders in the field and other clinicians, um, and this was really cemented when I went to a conference in Copenhagen, which is a really cool city. If any, people haven't gone to, it's just so fun. Um, to digress, just to see hundreds of people in this continual flash mob of bike riders, really high on their seat, is very cool. So it's called the ARDD. It's sort of the premier longevity conference, which is it's primarily driven by PhD researchers and tech companies. They had their first day. It was a whole week. It was in Niels Bohr auditorium where he used to teach, and they had his statue out front in this really like 200-year-old auditorium. So it was a really cool experience because you can meet these leaders and you got to hear what they were talking about, and everyone was very detailed and very knowledgeable in particular spaces, but they couldn't see or they didn't know how that what they were doing sometimes connected to something else. Um, and that struck me as like, well, that's a problem, right? It's a problem if we're trying to engineer a solution. If you think of health as a symphony, right? And this seems to be an analogy that's useful for people. Is if you want to play this beautiful concert piece, which was composed by a fabulous composer, you can't just go out with a violin, right? You can't just go out with a tuba. You can't just go out with a trombone. Um, you need a whole bunch of highly talented musicians. The current world of Western medicine is about solo, right? It's about soloist. It's one molecule, it's one um, intervention. But it really, due to the nature of how things are tested, you know, there's very rarely that sequenced um, or combinations of interventions work. So the symphony that we want to create to actually do true age reversal requires a multitude of instruments played by highly talented musicians that can come together. So that's one piece of it. But not only do you need this great team and this great musical ensemble, you need a score. You need a conductor, because they just start randomly playing what they like to play. That's not going to work either. And then for each particular person, in essence, that score may be different. So the sequencing, the harmonics, what comes first, what comes last, are all going to be a little bit different. So that is not happening. It just, it was really clear to me that's not happening, because we have great musicians, but we don't have people who want to play in a band, for a number of reasons, or can't play in a band. Um, and there's very few clinical composers that are actually saying, how do we get these instruments to play together, to help me, to help you, to the music that we need to achieve. And um, and it's like, well, there's a lot of bright, and then I'll flip the other side. So there's a lot of doctors in the longevity space, and I'm in a longevity group now, and they all tend to have a superpower, right? They all tend to be, they're knowledgeable in hyperbarics, or they're knowledgeable at regenerative care, or they're really good at hormonal health, or, it's very difficult, to, as a clinician, and I'm not actively full practicing. So I do research to help people who are ill, because that's why they're coming to you. And there's more longevity where people are actually looking for expanding health span. But for the most part, they have a business to run, and they find out what works for them and what they like to do. And then they have to maintain their personality and business, and it's a business. So it's hard for them to track data. It's hard for them to play that symphony, because it's just quite impossible. There's a couple, but that's about it. So we have this void of opportunity, and it saw me, and I said, well, what if, right? What if we got a group of like-minded clinicians, and we started to build out a band? And maybe we started just playing a little bit together. We're riffing, we're playing, two or three or four of us, and someone says, hey, I'd like to play with you, that sounds really fun. And then people start to, if you ever seen flash mobs, people start to stand around, and then you get more people coming and coming, and then someone says, you might want to try doing something a little differently. And so that's my vision, is sort of flipping the model, creating this quantum leap. Not only it's a little play on words, it's like a quantum leap in thought, and eventually perhaps quantum computing, where we can take this band and start, instead of having to run, which initially our plan is to run 10 people through a very specific targeted protocol, based on, the musicians that we have. Um, we may find we're missing one, right? There may be one that's just not quite right. It's pretty good, but the composer can always hear, it's like, it's not going to get it done. But then eventually, narrative to say, it's like, with AGI right now, forget quantum, maybe we could run 10 million trials of these sequenced therapies, and figure out the best way to run them. I have ideas, and all our different human brains have ideas, and I think we can do a good job now. We could do a far better job than what's being done, in the age reversal space. And last comment is, what happens is, the other piece of it, no one really plays to a score. So even the people who are opening get the idea that multiple modalities need to happen. there's still, I'm going to go to get a gene therapy here. I'm going to do plasma exchange there. I'm going to take rapamycin. Oh, wait, someone's talking about that. Here's a new molecule. I'm just going to add that in. No one's really saying, okay, what's the problem? How do I um, address it? And I'm an analogy guy. It's like, if you're going to remodel your kitchen, you're not bringing in the painter first, right? So in some ways, vision is general contractor, architect. We have this job to do. First, we need to clean. Then we need to, you know, break it down, and then we could do some framing or whatever needs to do, and then you decorate, and then you put in your appliances. And the appliances are the fun part. The decoration is the fun part, and most people tend to run to that first, as opposed to clearing out, and we'll go back to the body, clearing out inflammation, mitochondrial function, reactive oxygen species. So these things which are causing signals, to go in the wrong direction. And, so if you would take someone who's got lots of inflammation and try and put in, say, plasma, young plasma, that could be a problem, right? You could create this senescent cell multiplier for some people. And so it's understanding what we need to do. So I could go on, but I think you get the gist of what we're trying to achieve. And our goal will be to have a clinic out of the US initially for some of these therapies so we can do them safely, but not in a overly controlled, managed way, which doesn't allow you to be inventive, right? It's like telling a chef, okay, you want to add a different flavor. Now you have to put in a paper. Right? You need to tell us why you want to do that. And by the time you've done that, you've lost your motivation of what you even were thinking, or the composer. Like you just have to do. And as long as you're safe, you're not going to cause any problems.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In your view, what is the maximum lifespan for a human, and what do you think in the modern world are the biggest impediments to that?
Uh, I think it's pretty clear that we don't get past 110. You and I probably have even though we're healthy, maybe we'll be a little better as of today, right? So if we did nothing except followed the current health trends, right? Let's forget about quantum longevity or putting together all these different interventions like eating clean and being fit and sleep and doing the healthy things that, whether it's carnivore or vegan, whatever that might be, and there are nuances. Our chance of getting past 100 is probably one in a couple thousand, right? Something will there's an exponential decline. Maybe a little better. Maybe we make it to 110. I mean, you can look at long-lived populations, and we might be able to optimize that. But there's a threshold. There's at some point the body just can't repair itself. So based on our women do a little bit better, and there's some whole variety of reasons potentially, but that's where we are. How do we? So, what was the second question? How do we get more people to get to 100?
No, not necessarily. I was just curious what you think the impediments are to, if 110 is the maximum.
I
Um,
think, yeah, currently, I think we
yeah,
can do better, but yeah,
and so what do you think is preventing more people from hitting that number or getting past that number? If you had to say the
that,
top
that's
five
that
things.
that's a whole lecture. Top five things. I think from my science side is poor metabolic health, one, right? Um, and I don't know how you want me to break this down into things that they're doing that are harmful or to problems that occur in their body. So let's just go with problems. Poor metabolic health and all the consequences of that, um, which drive into, we'll call them, we like to call them like kick the bucket, things that will get you. So we're only as strong as our weakest link. So I think another problem that occurs for people is they, it's just human. We focus on what we're good at and we don't pay attention to what's our weakness. And if you're an athlete, it's better to focus on recovery and not getting injured than getting that 5% better. So a lot of what I see people do is I'm going to take 50 supplements, but I'm not sleeping, right? So it's not being aware of the things that are going to cut them down more than. So I think that's the second big piece. The third, I'd say probably modern world toxins would be, we can probably bucket that into whether it's iron or EMF or chemicals. They're they go back to point one, but that's an external factor that's a little bit hard to control, and maybe it's a little bit in category two, but we need to pay attention to that, sort of in the strategy of moving forward. Like you can't restructure your room or remodel your room until you clean out the trash. So we certainly need to be aware of all the toxins, whether it's toxic thoughts or toxic emotions or chemicals or iron, etc. Um, I think that I would just go, those three are just, so everything fits into those three. If someone is strongly metabolically healthy, they're toxin free, and they've paid attention to tracking whether it's heart disease or cancer or being aware of those things, the likelihood of making to 100 skyrockets. And sort of a weird reference, but if you look at billionaires, and they're having more traditional Western care, but I looked this past year and it was like a large percentage of them live past 90. Like, and it was like trying to, it's like they probably just have lots of people watching after them. Not that the Western care is going to get you further, and it's hard to say what their health is, but in some backwards way, just having someone regularly pay attention to them was a benefit, seemingly, right? At least just from a quick look.
Yeah, that benefits probably to your second point, which is pointing out what they're unaware of, like what to look after because they're so focused on their strengths and in doing what is working. Um, yeah, I mean, that's sort of my same conclusion as well, those 3 points that you brought up. Um, with regard to just general metabolic health, where do you think the bottleneck is? If you had to kind of, I'm asking you to be more reductive right now, but like kind of keep zooming into where along that pathway do you think the majority of the problems are? Do you think that that is occurring, for example, in the ETC? Do you think that's occurring uh, in the the between the cell and the mitochondria? Do you think it's happening outside? Where do you think, if you could choose one bottleneck for the most amount of people, where do you think it is?
My guess, and this we're going deeper than I take myself, right? So I tend to put myself as a wider thinker and dot connector and strategist. While I understand what's going on, I don't spend, it's like the general contractor. I know where the electric goes, but I don't know everything about doing all the wiring. However, said that, I would probably gather with the cytochrome 4 in the electron transport chain. There's probably other pieces that are clearly important, as well with cell signaling. But as per Morley, for at least that's the lens that I'm taking now, and it's sort of hard to ignore that lens. If that iron is not being oxidized properly, and you don't have copper to do the job, how are you producing energy, right? And if you can't produce energy and you're spinning off, you know, reactive oxygen species, you know, you're done, right? You're not going to overcome that. And the body, you're creating DNA damage in the mitochondria. And there was a paper last year that showed like longevity was related to the ability to repair mitochondrial DNA, which was really quite interesting. So it was species dependent. So, and I'll take one other piece, is we do, as part of this quantum longevity effort, one of our key partners has a transcript omic assessment. So they're able to look at how the RNA is transcribing DNA into proteins. And then computation has gotten sophisticated enough that they can see signals of these proteins and how they relate to some of the drivers of aging. The three that come up almost all the time as primary factors are mitochondrial energy production, inflammation, and reactive oxygen species. So it's pretty clear that if that's not working, or if it's not working properly, things are going to skew, from that piece. So yeah, cytochrome for iron copper balance is a big one in my mind.
So this one I'm one of the strategies for managing that, other than repleting copper continuously, is removing iron. And so in your, I saw in your sort of protocol list, there are two ways of essentially doing that are phlebotomy, and I don't know how to pronounce the chemicals that's the iron chelator.
Afroximine, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
dafroxin, yeah. Which we're working on some strategies. It's but yes, you can chelate it out. There's some challenges with that. But if you're stuck, there could be some benefits in utilizing that as part of something called an mTOR cycle as well, which has to do with energy sensing in the cell. But we're gone off topic there. But yes, getting blood out of the system, and that, as Morley has certainly shared, and I'll share again. And the deeper I look at it, is a huge problem. Um, and even when I see people who on the surface look like they're anemic, and they could be anemic, right? What is anemia? Well, let's not go. They look iron deficient, which is different than anemia. Anemia in terminology is lack of red cells, right? So you're anemia without red cells or lower red cells. That means, so if, for us, the average hemoglobin in a man could be 14, or the range is 14 to 17, 16 and a half, right? So if our hemoglobin was 12 and a half, we would be called anemic. Let's say our hemoglobin, which is the major carrier of iron. So I sort of flipped from red cells to hemoglobin there, but I think you understand what I was talking about. So if our hemoglobin is 15, but what's looked at now is ferritin, right? And that's for, so ferritin's looked at and that's low. They say, oh, you're iron deficient. You need more iron, right? Especially if someone has some fatigue symptoms. That's where the big problem is, right? It's like, okay, you have enough red cells, you have enough hemoglobin. Ferritin, which is an inflammatory marker, may be just fine. And that's, listen to Morley's talk for more depth on that. But we need to look at then iron saturation, right? And then what's iron saturation? What's your serum iron, you know, relationship transferrin, which is the protein that carries iron. And now you start to get a better example. And I'll give you an example here. What happened um, recently? That is more of an indicator of iron overload. And it could go even one step further, because I've seen iron saturations that are actually pretty good or even low. But just, if you go through the history of a person, there's just no way that person is iron deficient. So the next level of investigation is it in the spleen, right? Is it in the liver? And it's just stuck there, right? So it's just bound up and iron is not being released. The calculations of theoretically 1 milligram accumulation of iron every day over 40 years is 15 grams of iron, right? I think if you do the calculations of 250 milligrams of iron per unit of blood. So every time you donate blood, you're getting rid of 250 milligrams. Well, that is, to get rid of all your excess iron, that's 70. That's 70 donations,
Right.
based on the math. And I don't know how that completely pans out. So the example I was going to give you was a professional cyclist came to us, and he had done some blood work and his ferritin was low and he wasn't feeling that great. So he started going on iron. He felt a little better initially, and then he really tanked. His iron saturation was like 54%, so way above his hemoglobin was 17, but his ferritin was 20. So mismatch, completely iron overloaded because they looked at the wrong piece of the puzzle. And there's, as you see, there it's even more nuanced. And there's another woman who's a physician, actually a longevity physician, that I'm helping sort of guide her. She was a triathlete, took a bunch of iron, never a heavy bleeder, um, and all her markers are showing sort of lowish iron, low iron saturation, low ferritin. Hemoglobin's okay, but I just, intuitively, if we look deeper, my sense is she's also iron overloaded. And sometimes it takes, I don't know, it takes, I wouldn't say guts per se, but if, to see in the face of what you've always believed and say, no, no, what if we just pulled a little bit of iron out of her? Because sometimes once you donate, you can start things moving. So one of the strategies with her is like, okay, you know, maybe just pull a half a unit, and see how you do. Because people donate blood all the time. You're not really anemic per se. And let's see if you feel better. Let's look at your levels and so forth. So it's a very nuanced um, space to
Yeah,
be in.
it is. We've covered a lot of iron discussions a couple times with Morley, another Dr. Robert Thompson, and it's the deeper I go into it, the more the nuance becomes so gray. You can't quite tell, like you can't quite tell what exactly is going on at some level. But I wanted to ask you, did I see that you do MRIs of livers for looking at iron deposits?
That's one of yes, yes, but I haven't been able to get them sort of globally available. There are some companies that are doing this now, and there are two companies that have software that we can just upload into the cloud that will analyze the data as long as the MRI centers do a very simple, you know,
Mm.
validation procedure beforehand. But to get the MRI centers to do that in today's world, getting to the person who's willing to do something a little bit different and I only say this and people can make whatever of it. Two MRI centers said, we are just too busy doing MRIs for cardiomyopathy to worry about iron. We're backed up 3 months, so whatever that means. So they're just not able. Having said that, there are some companies that are in the space coming out that are looking at metabolic health, and I'm hoping to work with. This is sort of cool. There's um, a I'll leave the name off because I'm not sure if you wanted me to share this, but sort of a well-known nutrition educator in California, physician, and he shared with me that he is involved with a group that's purchasing an HMO in Los Angeles of sort of underserved Medicare, Medicaid population. They hope to take this 10,000 group HMO plan and start instituting progressive preventive um, strategies. So there will be very much, hopefully, a potential we can run a series. They're going to have an MRI, and they're like, totally, he gets it, right? So they'd like to run MRIs on people. They're like, use acarbose, use rapamycin, whatever it's going to take to do get them off of junk. They're going to take this in this group that's getting the worst of Western medicine and begin to implement that. My hope is then we can then have more data to say, look, we can look at the liver, we can look at the spleen and go, look, there's no correlation. I have been told that by the Australian company that does the iron scan analysis. And I asked them, and it was like I took a breath. It's like, okay, do you see a correlation between ferritin and iron saturation per se, other than if it's excessively high, right? You know, if someone's hemochromatosis or completely iron overloaded due to thrombocytopenia, et cetera, and blood transfusions, they go no, right? So there's the two cases that we shared, you know, are exactly what they see. They could be iron overloaded or not. You know, the bloods don't seem to correlate well with that. So we have some intuition. In essence, assume that it's a problem, and that's where I go. Assume that there's too much iron, unless you can prove or make a case, like a 25-year-old vegan woman who has heavy periods that's never eaten meat, right? Eating a lot of phytates and low calorie, and an athlete, right? Maybe, right? And never took iron supplements, and had a GI bleed. You know, so it's that much data would convince me that someone truly had tissue iron deficiency.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk more about other aspects of metabolic health, hindrances there. Do you have favorite tests for giving someone an assessment with regard to
I
these?
do, and you know, it's yeah. Let's go from simple, and then some things that we're going to be vetting out because they're putting together sort of some strategies. Because the challenge is we can do sophisticated mitochondrial testing, right? In We were talking off camera, you know, in a lab in Germany that actually looks at the electron transport chain, and eventually that'll be through blood spot. Our hope is to actually give us activity. There's even a company I believe called Mitoswab that looks at mitochondrial function for mitochondrial genetic diseases, but they're at least the last time I spoke to their cytochrome 4 they didn't think was quite as precise as they want it to be. But the point is, it's a lab, right? So while it can give us good information, numbers have variance, and you know the methodology may not be as precise as we want, but certainly we can tell if you're extremely off or not. From a simplistic point of view, right? So then we can go through and say, what are some things that we want to look at metabolically? You know, fasting lactic acid is a simple one that people, you know, don't look at. You have it's if you're burning fat, you know, if you're a slow burner and if your mitochondrial are more efficient, you should have a low lactic acid. What I regularly see is people who have chronic fatigue or some post viral issue, um, and their lactic acid fasting is high, right? So that's a simple little test that you can do, and it could be it doesn't always pan out, but it certainly confirms. Um, you can look at obviously some of the traditional metabolic markers, um, although they're not directly mitochondrial driven. Um, the other thing we'll be doing is looking at circadian temperature, right? So that's one that isn't regularly done. So there's some good data, and I've spoken to some people in Europe who use these for cyclists. If you look at temperature, you should have a variance from high to low. People who are metabolically unhealthy or not producing energy efficiency have a low body temperature. You know, it's the old Rhoda Barnes hypothyroid. You know, what they used to do is check temperature of mouth, right? Okay. You know, it was an oral temperature or it was an underarm temperature. Sorry, first thing in the morning. So it was a baseline. There's technology now that you can wear a patch that measures temperature 24 hours a day,
Mm.
and it measures actually heat transfer. So you can get temperature every 1 to 10 minutes, depending on the device. If you're mitochondrial and metabolically unhealthy, it should be low. As you get healthier, it should be high, but there also should be higher in the morning and lower at night. And there's also so people who are waking up low, it may be a sign that they're not getting enough carbohydrates, right? So they're not fueling their mitochondria more efficiency. So this nuance of temperature could be really powerful. So something I'm playing around with, and it seems to be, but I want to verify what intuition and the research is showing. But it could be a really powerful way to understand, because there's a U-shaped curve. So we know hypothermia or lowering body temperature could slow metabolism, and that may be health beneficial. Sort of, you see body temperature go down with fasting. You see body temperature go down with people who are calorie restriction. Um, and some people, in the rapamycin mTOR world, which is sort of mimics that, also seems to suggest that that happens with them. But no one is really, very few, or no one that I know of, is using this circadian um, device.
Mhm.
What I was going to say with that. So U-shaped curve, but the thing with lowering temperature is, and it's a problem, is you don't want to do that all the time, right? Your body needs fluctuation. You might have a period of low temperature, a period of fasting, but the body needs to switch. It needs to be at catabolic and anabolic. It needs to clean house. It needs to rebuild. And one thing I see in our work, I advise a company with 3,000 people taking rapamycin, and rapamycin is I don't know if you've ever talked about that, but it's a pharmaceutical, well, it's a natural molecule that was found in bacteria to protect against fungus. It was found in the soil of Easter Island, and it turns out initially um, it was thought to be an antifungal. Then they found it had immune modulating effects, and in higher dosing, it could cause an immune suppressant, which could help with organ transplant rejection. Within this process, along the way, it got tested in these particular longevity trials called the ITP, where they do 3 sets of testing on rodents, and they found that to this day it has had the strongest signal for metabolic health and lifespan in rodents. The key about this rapamycin is it uncovered this pathway. So it's the case where a molecule helped us understand a pathway, and this mechanism target of rapamycin, which has been conserved for billions, millions and millions of years across species, is a way we sense energy. And when rapamycin is turned on, we grow, we get bigger, tissues bring in oxygen and iron. This iron triggers mTOR, and everything gets bigger. The analogy is, look at baseball players 40 years ago versus now. They were 6 feet, 180 versus 6'2", 220. And, like, go look at the Yankees celebration in the 80s. It was like, oh my God, they look like high school players. It was visually is crazy. So we have a much bigger population. The problem with mTOR is it drives poor metabolic health, and it turns cells into being gerosenescent and then senescent, which drives disease. By tamping mTOR, through fasting or rapamycin, and it's a tweak, you can improve that sensitivity and sort of take your foot off the gas pedal. We could go on and talk about this for a bunch of times. The key point is, anyone who's trying this or doing this, you can't do it all the time. Right? You need to tamp down, and then you need to grow. You need to tamp down, so cycle. Come off of it, spend a month, eat more calories, try and get stronger, and then go back down again. And the extreme cases, Roy Wolford coming out of the biosphere, which was the 2-year study, and he looked like he came out of a concentration camp, right? Not a picture of health. So, can calorie restriction, he didn't, I don't know what he continued doing, but Roy Walford didn't make it past 80, right? I'm not sure. Not much longer than that. So we can't do one thing to an extreme. So rapamycin plays a role, and temperature plays a role with that. Getting back to your other questions, metabolic testing, is another way to actually do coronary pulmonary exercise testing. Looking at not just VO2 max, but looking at certain anaerobic threshold points, looking at resting metabolic rate, and now you can start to validate across the spectrum. And I want to make a point to people as well, because it's another thing that's been missed, is, and VO2 max, has sort of gotten a lot of press. Raise your VO2 max, raise your VO2 max. It's a good thing. Higher your VO2 max is, the longer you're going to live. No, no, no. If your VO2 max is, and let's think about this. Again, we're all individual. The biggest difference with VO2 max occurs when you take someone who's really low and take him from the low percentile to maybe a mid percentile. That's the huge difference. You're getting them moving. The mitochondria now have gone to a, they're functioning more, at least reasonably well. Pushing my VO2 max up to a higher level intentionally may increase density. It may increase mitophagy, which is good. But what if there's toxins? What if there's inflammation? What if there's iron? What if there's decreased copper? What's going to happen? Reactive
OS.
oxygen
Yeah.
species,
Right.
right? So,
Yeah.
so now you take an athlete, you take it, it's like, and I use the analogy of, you can have a 4x4, a diesel, or, it flies up the hill and still spewing lots of, fumes. You want the Tesla, but just putting a bigger engine in that truck, if it's spewing out fumes, theoretically, in fact, we know there's a U-shaped curve, will increase your chance of metabolic issues or inflammation. So,
Yeah.
this is what we were talking about. We can't say one thing is good for everyone at both levels without understanding. Epidemiologically, absolutely. You take 1 million people or 10 million people and say, okay, those with a higher V2 max mostly are going to be healthier and they're going to be less likely to have metabolic disease. But you have to be much more granular and you have to see how that affects. So we just make these blanket statements in the medical world without any awareness or understanding of how it affects the individual. It's just so pervasive across the board, whether it's a dietary recommendation or a protocol recommendation or something that comes off of a rodent. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So it's,
Well,
to
to
me.
your point, it also, I've been looking at I've been looking a lot at CO2 as a marker of metabolic health, and
Mhm.
optimizing CO2. It's another proxy of the output of the electron transport chain, that's cheap relative to, say, testing the weight of ATP, from one of those mitochondrial markers, and it's got a lot of data behind it. And there are things that people can actively do to adjust that through the way that they're breathing. Nose breathing is a great example of that, and exercising while nose breathing. So instead of, high intensity mouth breathing training, they're doing it to nose breathing
Toxic
threshold.
training. Mhm.
Yes, et
Yep.
cetera, et
Mhm.
cetera. And so that seems to also not just be a measure of how of the functioning of the mitochondria, but also having protective benefits as well. Um, and that's
Mhm.
what making so interesting to me.
Correct. So, certain base trainings, and there is one device that I'm still waiting to vet out, is Calibre Bio. If you're familiar with them,
No.
CALIBRE.bio, and they've partnered with a exercise physiologist out of Duke. They're to measure O2 CO2, so you actually be able to sort of get a sense in a much more accurate at home way to sort of track where you're going. And one could, devices are fun, and and I think we need to go from, like you say, the mitochondrial testing, or from the longevity expert, the omic testing, right? To does someone look younger? Can they perform better? Right. And I actually heard someone the other day uh, was doing a talk on plasma exchange and the effect that had on proteomics. And he said, well, we're getting better at the molecules, and they are, they're much better at understanding the signals. And he goes, and Pastor goes, well, we could look at how people feel and how they perform, but we really want to know the molecules, right? So, I mean, but that that was the PhD researcher is like, we need to know the signals and the molecules. Yeah, whatever people are feeling. So it needs to be the other way around. Like we want people to feel and perform and look better. And we can, there's ways to monitor that pretty easily now. And then we can go back and say, how does that then correlate with, you know, the sophisticated technology? And do we know enough? Uh, Holding your breath, right? I mean, what about just, the bolt test, right? Can you hold your breath for a minute? Take a couple, sit there, take a couple, and if you can go a minute, you're probably pretty good, right? Are you going to lift to 150 by doing that? No, but if you can hold your breath for a minute, something is functioning pretty well, and you're able to tolerate CO2 at a higher level, and then release oxygen at a higher level.
Right,
And
right. Which
another
is
one just sort of,
that big,
yeah,
which is that big bottle. So related back to your comment about lactic acid, that is a big way that you turn off anaerobic glycolysis, is by increasing your CO2 because the Bohr effect, and that's like kind of missed. I feel like that's missed a lot in the space of looking at mitochondrial function. It's like, or metabolic health in general. It's like, how do you optimize the Bohr effect by, which is dependent on CO2. Like you can't get that offloading of oxygen unless there's enough of it. And that is, and back in the COVID days, everybody's measuring SpO2, which is kind of irrelevant. It's just like you're seeing an input that hasn't gone in yet to the mitochondria. So it's irrelevant.
yeah. So there's just things that aren't understood, and there's even a piece to carbon monoxide as well.
Hmm.
Um, so it's a byproduct of the breakdown of red cells. So if carbon monoxide levels are elevated, it's a sign of inflammation in some ways. So either the body's naturally doing it, or you're actually causing it. So you can actually monitor carbon monoxide and get carbon monoxide reduction through red light, right? Through blood donation, because carbon monoxide binds and sort of poisons partially irreversibly to the cell. Um, Once I learned that this was like, if you go back and look at the Tour de France in the 20s, you ever seen the classic picture? There's four guys there, and one of them has a cigarette smoking, and I was like, what the heck, right? It turns out that if you take carbon monoxide through cigarette smoking, you're bumping off oxygen briefly. So they learned intuitively smoke a cigarette before going up a hill, and they got this boost of power.
Interesting. So that doesn't relate
Interesting.
to, yeah. Well, so this is because the combustion of the tobacco, not because of the nicotine.
It's the combustion of tobacco
Right.
creating the CO, which then releases oxygen. And they learned that was a powerful way. And you can sort of do, I have the person who shared this with me, there's so many little tools, and yeah, I need a bigger team to test all these things out. But if you do rebreathing, like if you had a mask on and you did your CO2 rebreathing while you were performing some physical activity, you should perform better. And he showed me some papers that, so if you took a cyclist and had a glass visor, sort of like a luge visor, and they were riding to protect against the cold, and they were rebreathing, they should perform better for that same concept. And they don't have to hold their breath because they're just getting their CO2 that they're
Right. So you
exhaling
don't
out.
have to nose breathe. You can mouth breathe.
You can mouth breathe through the mouth. That's correct.
Right. Yeah. So you're just
Yeah.
basically holding on to CO2 a little bit more. Um,
Mhm.
and that makes sense. So, interesting. I want to circle back to your temperature comments because I feel like these are all really intimately related. You brought up Brodo Barnes and measuring underarm temperature, waking, and I've explored this a little bit. It's really, really quite interesting. And as far as like measuring at least in the morning, the afternoon, seeing it rise, and then what your temperature does in response to your meals, and how that can give you an indication of are you sort of thyroid is your body being run by thyroid, or is it being run by basically cortisol and adrenaline? And but you know what I found kind of comical, I think I saw this in your bio. You said something to the effect of you're the anti Brian Johnson view
That's all
of
right.
health. And I chuckled when I read that because I saw him post something on Twitter not long ago where his body temperature was like 94.6. And I don't recall what time of day that was, but like regardless, that's still really low.
It's really
And
low.
I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Um, not sure everything, off the top that he's doing, but I would suggest that there's two things. One is low calories, right? It looks like he's lower protein. I don't. I think his iron's pretty good. They've done MRI of his liver, and I haven't seen CBCs from his, but he has no visceral fat. He has no iron, so I'm sure that's really quite good. And visceral fat to me is the metabolic consequence of that mitochondrial inefficiency, right? So, if you're inefficient, where's it going to go? It's either iron or you're creating inflammatory signals, and it's almost, I don't know if they, but to me, it's the way I like to think of it. The body has to do with something with that, oxygen species, and somehow it's not taking the fat, or the fat it's not burning. It's not going to put it in the adipose. It's got to put it somewhere, right? Because it's not going to use it for energy. I liken it to it's our nuclear waste, right? It's the body's nuclear waste that it has to put somewhere in a place that it's not going to use for energy later on. And it could be completely wrong, but it's sort of an easy way to think of it because it's really bad, right? We need to get rid of it. Um, he takes like 13 milligrams of rapamycin. He takes a high dose of rapamycin as well. So, and I'm not sure if he's cycling through. So, the combination of lower calories, rapamycin, AMPK, I suspect he's just driving mTOR too hard. Um, can he get away with it? Are they controlling him that much? It's possible. It's possible, right? But you know, I think that's over. My sense is we don't need to be that tight. I could be wrong, and I'll take it once. If we have to be that minutia driven on all these interventions, you know, one, from my perspective, we're not reversing aging. We're just we've created this master contraption, for something we haven't figured out the real levers or the real problem because we're making it way too complicated. We need to tap into the body's own knowledge and then figure out how to say, okay, go do what you want to do because we're never going to replace every particular molecular pathway that has a deficiency, right? You probably go back what's the molecule of the week, right? Like, it went from alpha ketoglutarate to taurine to N-acetylcysteine and glycine, and there was another one this week that I stopped paying attention to it. So you just, okay, I'll take another pill in my box. So NAD was big, so forth. And then the other question is, how much does that extra effort get him? Does it get Brian to 110? I don't know, 105. I don't know, right? It doesn't get him to 150, unless he's doing some other things. So, he's done some gene therapies, and I'm not sure of sequencing, but just from someone who is going to do the lifestyle efforts, it's just the amount of effort it's going to take. And, think of like the Olympic athletes. You can be a good runner with 20% of the effort. And then if you want to be an Olympic athlete, you not only have to be gifted, but how much more time, what's the difference between, right, a college runner and an Olympic athlete? It's huge, huge
Mhm.
difference. So of time spent. So our goal should be the least we can do to achieve the greatest benefit because that extra amount of work, your return on investment is not going to be there, right?
Right.
As long as you're avoiding to kick the buckets. And if it's a time game, right? And for me, I'm not worried about you know, like if the goal is to reverse aging within a few years, are we worried about cancer and heart disease and dementia if you're healthy now? No, right? It's something you just it's down the road. And you know what? And if we do what's right now, those become inconsequential because the body shouldn't develop those problems, and they don't develop those problems when we're 25, right? So, you know, we're still using a lot of the, and you know, we're not there yet. So I understand why we have to use that logic or thought, but I'm trying to get out of that thought process of we don't need to if we really want to do this. Heart disease, cancer. I mean, that's standard. You know, the things are going to get us, but
Right. Um, just one last question here. Do you think that a optimal sex hormone profile is a good proxy for metabolic health?
yes,
And
especially in men. Yeah,
is it
especially
possible
in men.
to, and then conversely, is it possible to have a good, a optimal sex hormone profile with poor metabolic health?
It's a lot harder. So, okay, so there are a couple pieces, right? So if you break men's hormone, testosterone, total testosterone, free testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, estrogen as a secondary. We'll just use those. Testosterone is production. Free testosterone is what's getting to the cell because, and it's varied by the sex hormone binding globulin produced protein produced in the liver. The biggest metabolic fluctuation we see is that SHBG. Okay, so it's that hormone that protein that's being produced that's binding. So a lot of times I'll see guys who have their testosterone is reasonable enough, but they have very low free testosterone. I used to think, and it's probably still part of it, it was xenoestrogens that were driving up SHBG in the body was trying to bind them. And it certainly is, but now with the new Morley iron paradigm and actually going back and looking at people um, where SHBG was high, and I know a few very closely that are more carnivore-esque, eaters, and their testosterones are good. Their metabolic health is great. Their SHBG is high, and their free testosterones are low. And I've seen one now so far where they've donated blood and gotten iron out. Guess what? Free testosterone came back up. So there's another marker. So that's one. That's an iron play. So total testosterone, low free T, good metabolic health. Think iron first. Low total testosterone, metabolic, right? That's your metabolic marker. And seeing that too, like we had someone recently, healthy guy, golfer, very healthy golfer, got very much overweight, super large visceral fat. Testosterone was like hypogonadal. Being an athlete and still playing, even though he was like 40 pounds overweight, just has a nice swing. But he was motivated, finding he found his why. His why was like he didn't want to die, but his why was like golf. He wanted to keep playing golf. To him, that was more important, his family for sure, but golf was his passion. And to not be able to, he was afraid that he'd have to stop playing golf. And to him, that was like death. So he was motivated to change. His testosterone came up from 230 to 600 just by knocking his visceral fat down from like literally 7 pounds. It was awful. He's down to 3, which is still high, but 3 is so much better, than 7, which is quite horrifically high. So those are the, you know, if you hear hoofbeats, don't think of zebras, right? And yeah, there could be parathyroid hormones and and parathyroid tumor and other issues, or it could be a varicocele or et cetera, or it could be a medication. But in today's world, and the other interesting thing is total testosterone or levels are 20 to 30% lower in general than they were 20 to 30 years ago. So that's an issue. And then the one point to be aware of for each person when you're thinking total testosterone, and we all don't have this level, but what were your levels naturally when you were 30? Because someone, there's a definite link. If you look at studies like, testosterone does create a mental structure in the brain. So guys with higher testosterone tend to be in more risk physical professions. It's just they're driven that way, right? They're driven to athletics or orthopedic surgery, or so there's bits, and guys with lower testosterone tend to be, you know, not in any way, but accountants and pediatricians, and there's that's what testosterone does, right? So it's a softer, without talking anything gender. It's just, it's a drive. If your testosterone was 1,000 normally, and now it's down to 500, that's a problem. But if your testosterone was 600 and now it's 500, not a big deal.
Right.
So this is a Western medicine issue is, oh, you come in, you're not, like you want some testosterone, doc test you, it's like you're 500. Let's give you some testosterone. Maybe that's a bad thing to do if
Mhm.
you don't know where you were, So for me, like,
Yeah.
to take testosterone, and a little bit off topic, is unless someone is having their life sufficiently affected by sarcopenia, functional decline, complete ED, whatever it might be, and we need to get them going again, then sure, testosterone has its place, because you can't get someone to make life changes if they can't function.
Mhm.
But then maybe you start to wean it or pull it off. There's ways to do that. And then for most people, it's a metabolic issue, right? Or it's an iron issue. You fix those, and it
Yeah, I
gets
mean,
better.
if you're, and I would like to take a moment to talk about the women as well and their hormone profiles, but with regard to sex hormone binding globulin, if we're thinking about the same person, um, who's been public about it, I actually went through that same process, starting in June, because I was that candidate that you were just talking about, and so I've been doing regular phlebotomy, watching my iron numbers and watching SHBG and TSAT and all this stuff, and um, and I've seen it go down.
Mhm.
Not dramatically. It's gone down from, say, like 65 to 55, but
65. You're sat with 65%?
no, my SHBG, but
Oh,
my
okay.
TSAT
Okay.
was also very high. So it's
Okay.
now, I may have to do another measurement here because I just took a unit out a month ago. Um, but my point is that there's got to be other drivers, because as far as I know, albumin also can secondarily bind testosterone,
Mhm.
and
Weekly,
so
though.
Okay, so if you
Yeah.
have the same level of SHBG and the same level of albumin as you did but your free T is not changing, I feel like there's still another variable aside from iron that is driving this, other than, but you're still saying xenoestrogens or iron is what's driving SHBG.
Or something in the liver is driving SHBG, correct? Right. And there's, and I've never quite figured the teleology of this. Uh, Insulin has a fact too, right? So there's something to do with insulin. If insulin is lower, you actually get higher SHBG with insulin. So if you look at diabetics with higher insulin, they'll have lower SHBGs. And yeah, there's a reason in there that I haven't quite, I've known this for many years. So it's like, you know, do we need more carbohydrates?
Right. Yeah.
Is that, so I throw that in. If someone's really too low in carbohydrate, maybe that's another sign that they start to need to add more carbohydrates in, if we're suppressing insulin down too far, or we're not getting enough fluctuation. So it would be my next
Yeah.
thing to at
Well,
least consider.
yeah, in my case, I'm getting plenty. But so okay, yeah, that's like a longer discussion for another time. So with regard
Yeah,
to
no,
women,
keep tracking it. Yeah, so it's like not too many people keep tracking it. Let's see where it goes, and then we can sort of figure out. Happy to help sleuth it if we can.
cool.
What's your is
Um,
your total fine? It's just the free chain?
It's, it'll depend. I mean, the biggest thing I've noticed is that the depth, the consistency of my sleep has the biggest impact on my total T. And so, of all of the variables, so I'll see it anywhere between 950 and 500, depending on um, like how well I'm sleeping is like the big thing. But most
No.
consistently,
Okay.
it'll show up between say like 750 and 850. And I probably measured it 7 times in the last 7 months. So monthly I'll measure it with my iron panel. And so yeah, um,
There's another
but
thing you mentioned sleep. To me, that metabolic piece is deep sleep, and we really don't have a in the current run. There's some devices out there, perhaps, but the standard devices, especially people wearing whoops and auras, they're just not reliable on deep sleep at this
right,
point. And if we can't track deep sleep efficiently, then how do we know, right? And they'll even say, like you say, it's like what's the perceived. That's another thought. It's like what's your perceived sleep sometimes is more important than deep sleep.
yeah,
But I think for I'd rather see a trend. Like, if from an age reversal point of view, someone younger has your deep sleep is really good and deep sleep declines as we get older. If I see deep sleep flip through interventions are getting better and trending over time, to me, that's a nice sign that something's happening in the body that's more youthful. It's in a better state. So just a simple phenotypic way to address that. Maybe not directly mitochondrial metabolic, but it's sort of a restorative. The body is better able to, since in deep sleep we're more restorative.
yeah. Um, so with regard to say progesterone and estrogen in that ratio for women, what I see a lot is just a kind of a massive depletion of progesterone and
Mhm.
in whatever form estrogen dominance shows up, but it's usually to do with like, stress, xenoestrogens, and like all the things that go along with stress, and which is depleting progesterone. Is that what you also see? And would you say
Is
that
it obviously progesterone's in that same pathway? So clearly, because progesterone steal progesterone can go to cortisol. So if from a very simple biochemical method, yes, right. If you're going to produce more stress, you need more cortisol. You're going to steal from the progesterone pathway. Estrogen then can be estrogen can be produced though, Morley talks as estrogen as an antioxidant. So in some ways, estrogen can rise as a way to protect the body. Not sure that's part of it. I can buy part of that for sure. Um, but it does seem to also correlate well with obviously visceral fat and insulin issues. So we know there's a large component to that as well.
thank you
Yeah,
so
yeah.
much for talking. I hope we can do this again
No worries.
sometime.